Epiphone ES-335 versus the Epiphone Sheraton. Which one is for you? Let's put them back to back so you can hear what these two sound like. I'm going to tell you my thoughts on these two guitar models. We're going to do a whole tonal comparison between the two of them. Let us know what you think in the comments. Please follow the link below where you can listen to some music. You can hear some of these guitars on studio recordings. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy. So Epiphone has a long history of being associated with great hollow body guitars, hollow body and semi-hollow body. And they are connected with Gibson, but not entirely exclusive just to Gibson sub-brand. If you don't know the history of Epiphone, Epiphone was one of Gibson's big competitors in the early days before the company was running into trouble and Gibson wound up buying them out. And then even for a while, production was still right up on par with Gibson. As opposed to nowadays, now Epiphone guitars are still great guitars, but they are more relegated to a sub-role compared to their Gibson counterparts. This is all going to become a little bit important as we talk about this later on. So today we're talking about the Epiphone ES-335 and the Epiphone Sheraton. Now, what are these two models specifically? Well, this one is an Epiphone ES-335 Pro, and the other guitar that I'm playing is the Epiphone Sheraton 2. The reason I'm drawing that distinction is many of them have mostly pretty similar features. There will be some little differences and everything. One big reason that I'm mentioning that, and that is I am not going to do the coil splitting on this guitar for this video. The reason for that is because these two models are actually flipped from what's going to be currently available when it comes to these two models. The new Epiphone model ES-335, which is the inspired by Gibson model, this is the new one they're coming out with, does not have coil splitting. The Epiphone Sheraton 2 Pro does have coil splitting. That one is not a Sheraton 2 Pro, it is a Sheraton 2, it doesn't have coil splitting. So, these two guitars, this one has coil splitting, that one doesn't. They're modern counterparts, probably the production models that most of you would be looking at if you're buying new. The Sheraton would have coil splitting, and this one wouldn't. So for the sake of not getting into the headache of it, I'm just not going to coil split this one. I'm going to give you the back-to-back comparison just on full humbucking mode. Now there's a second reason for that, and I do want to mention that overall, the Sheraton is a step up from the ES-335. How am I tying these in? Well, the number one thing that I noticed is the hardware. The hardware on the Sheraton is better. This one has very, very cheap tuners. Now, if you haven't seen my full review of this guitar, please check it out because I talk about this in a little bit more detail. This guitar is an excellent build. I was very, very impressed with the build and the tone and the resonance. However, it was plagued by cheap hardware, really cheap tuners, and the neck coil split is a little bit shoddy. If I pull out the neck coil split, it doesn't necessarily split the coils. I have to wiggle with it and kind of mess around with it a little bit. That's not really that uncommon on this model to have kind of shoddy parts. Most people in the comments had mentioned they actually had problems with the switch. Build quality, I still think the Sheraton's a little bit better, but build quality, this one is not lacking. And that was why I was a little disappointed in the hardware, because I thought it's such a great build of a guitar. Why can't you just do a little bit better hardware? If you're looking at the current production inspired by Gibson ES-335, from my understanding from other players, this is not as much of an issue, and on these, it is a consistency thing. So if you're looking at a 335 Pro, you may have no problem with pots. A lot of people said they had no problem with the pots. Many of them said they had a problem with the switch. Some people said they had no problem at all. Most of them said the tuners weren't great. But the whole point is that with a model like this, with it being a step down from the Sheraton, even though tonally it's going to deliver a very, very similar sound and kind of be useful for a lot of the same applications, if you're a home player, if you're kind of a beginner or an intermediate looking at this, playing mostly at home for fun, it's probably not going to be much of an issue. If you're getting up to kind of an upper media and advanced player and you're looking at it for gigging and recording, you're going to want to put a little extra money into this one probably for some of the hardware. To upgrade the tuners, that's not really that big a deal, but on a semi-hollow guitar to upgrade the pots and the electronics, parts-wise, it's not that expensive, but if you're not able to do it yourself, a luthier is going to charge more money to work on a semi-hollow guitar. So if you're looking at this guitar with that in mind, yes, the build quality is great. Yes, with a little bit of kind of upgrade, you can really bring it up to the next level. However, it's more of a big deal than it would be on a solid body guitar. Let's say that. The tone of this one I found a little bit punchier, and I think it's going for a more diverse kind of musical crowd, people looking at it for different genres. The pickups I thought sounded not quite as good quality-wise as the Sheraton, but a little bit more versatile. They seemed to kind of cover more territory. They had a little bit more of a rock snarl to them. They had a little bit more of an edge when I was pushing them with drive and everything. Of course, being an ES-335, now an ES-335 was a Gibson model. Epiphone's equivalent, a rough equivalent, would have been the Epiphone Sheraton and the Epiphone Riviera. Now, in the early days, the Epiphone Riviera was more like the 335 and the Sheraton was more like the ES-355, which was the custom. Why am I bringing that up? The new one is the Sheraton 2. The Sheraton 2 is much more similar to a 335 in general in its build. However, it's still been around for a long time. This one, with the exception of the coil splitting, is pretty close to a Gibson ES-335 in a lot of ways. This particular one with the block inlays is kind of inspired by the model that Eric Clapton played in Cream. Really, really classic guitar, great for blues rock, and again, there's a richness to the pickups. The pickups sounded better than I expected. They drive a little bit more, and I think that these pickups are pretty versatile and can cover a lot of territory. Also, if you're talking about the guitars back-to-back, I actually prefer the neck on this guitar. I found the neck and the fretwork on this guitar a little bit more comfortable. Again, the build quality of this, the wood, the resonance, is very, very good, and I have no qualms with that whatsoever. Now we have this guitar. This is the Sheraton 2. Now, I mentioned the Riviera and the original Sheraton. Now, the Riviera and the original Sheraton each would have had mini humbuckers in them. Now, the Riviera would have been more the plain guitar with the plain fingerboard, whereas the Sheraton was the more ornate one. They were both dual pickup guitars. They both had the dual mini humbuckers. So that's why I mentioned the Sheraton would have been more like the ES-355, whereas the Riviera would have been more like the 335, with the exception of the pickups. That's kind of a rough metaphor, but that's basically a similarity in kind of what they were. The Sheraton 2 is the new production model that has been around for quite a while, and the big difference is they now use full-size humbuckers, which does make it much more like a Gibson ES-335. It's a semi-hollow, which means it has the full block piece of wood through the middle, which helps eliminate some feedback, adds a little sustain. It's a nice kind of solid guitar. The 335, by the way, also semi-hollow, also has the center block. So when you're talking about the build and what it is functionally, they're very, very similar. The build, the shape of the guitar, the pickups, the center block, You've got 4 knobs and a switch and everything. Coil splitting, depending on the model that you get. If you get the Sheraton 2, if you find an older Sheraton 2, no coil splitting. If you get the Sheraton 2 Pro, there is coil splitting. If you get the ES-335 Pro, there is coil splitting. If you get the new Inspired by, there's no coil splitting. So I don't like coil splitting anyway. I've talked about that before in other videos. I don't find it unusable, but I find it kind of gimmicky and just not what the guitar is meant to do. I think playing on full humbucking mode is kind of a better representation of what the guitar is. Now this one has the really fancy kind of ornate headstock. Again, I mentioned it has the Grover tuners, has fancier inlays down the fingerboard. This one's heavier, and oddly enough, it's a little bit brighter and a little bit snappier. Now, I mentioned that the quality of the pickups on the 335 Pros, better than I expected, not quite as good as these, but more versatile. If you'll notice, I find these have more of kind of a vintage, woody squishiness to them. They sound much bluesier, much jazzier, whereas the 335 Pro ones sound much more like a rock pickup. They are a little bit more suited to gain. They're a little bit more suited to kind of push the guitar a little further. But I thought these, even though they couldn't drive quite as much, they had a little bit more character to them. I thought they sounded a little bit richer. Again, this might go into kind of the model. You know, the classic Epiphones in the early days never really used much by famous rockers. The most famous early player of the Sheraton would have been John Lee Hooker. Very, very famous later player of the Sheraton would have been Noel Gallagher from Oasis. When you're talking about the 335, I mentioned Eric Clapton. Of course, there's Lee Carlton. Eric Johnson plays the 335, even though he's not as much known for it. Now, these are all playing the Gibson ones. And one you could kind of lump in with both of these would be B.B. King. Now, B.B. King for a while did play an ES-335. He's mostly known for playing his ES-355, and that kind of morphed into his Lucille model. This one in particular, the black with the gold, really reminds me of Lucille, even though he never played an Epiphone Sheraton to my knowledge. And he only briefly played the 335 before he got into his other guitars that were the more notable Lucille models. But if you're into B.B. King, or if you're really just into classic blues a lot, you know, whether it's B.B. King or Freddie King or a whole slew of others, either of these guitars are a great choice for that kind of sound. So again, has the Grover tuners, fancier inlays. I think the pickups sound a little bit better. Never had any problem with the pots or the switch or the jack or anything on this. It all just, again, feels a little bit like the next level up of guitar. It is a little bit more expensive. For some people, it's going to be worth the extra money. For other people, the 335 is going to be worth the extra money. The other thing that I really like and appreciate about this model is this is an Epiphone specific model. Even though you could say, yeah, the new one is very much like an ES-335 with the dual humbucking pickups. The thing about it is that I like that it pays tribute to the classic history of Epiphone as its own unique brand as opposed to a Gibson sub-brand. Now, the Epiphone 335 is a fine guitar, but it is not as good as a Gibson ES-335 in quality of wood, in quality of build, in quality of tone, playability, setup, you know, parts, hardware, you name it. Being a 335 player, the 335 Pro is a fine guitar. You can get it, you can love it, you can use it for years, especially if you upgrade some parts and everything. But people love to say it, it's not as good as a Gibson ES-335. In any objective way you can make that judgment, it doesn't measure up. This one is kind of more its own thing, and I also think this one measures up a little bit better to a Gibson equivalent. So keep that in mind. Again, that all being said, the ES-335 is still a great guitar. It's one that you can still use, you can get for less expensive. So it depends on what your budget is and what your needs are. So let's get back to some tones here. You just heard it for a jam in the beginning. I'm going to do a pickup by pickup comparison, going neck in the middle setting and then the bridge. We're going to play both clean and overdriven and go back to back doing the same thing on each guitar so that you can really hear them directly contrasted and see what you think of either one. I'm playing into a VHT Amps D-Fifty. It's a famous D-style amplifier, and it also has kind of a touch of English glassiness to it. It's a great amp. I highly recommend checking out. I've also done a full review of that if you want to check that out. For my overdriven tones, I'm using a Vick Audio Mount Pleasant, which is Vick Audio's take on a blues breaker. one of my favorite overdrives, really, really great overdrive pedal that I got in a custom blue enclosure. Let us know which one you like better in the comments. Let us know if you own either of these. If you have the 335 Pro, have you had good luck with it, or have you had one that needed some parts to be upgraded? Again, if anything, it's a consistency issue. It's not across the board. Are you a Sheraton player? There are a lot of great Sheratons out there. It's a great guitar that I feel has been sadly a little bit overlooked, but it still kind of keeps up that great rich history of Epiphone archtop guitars. Let us know what you think in the comments. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and follow that link below where you can hear some music. I use all these guitars to record studio tracks. You can hear them if you follow me on Spotify. I'm going to put a link right down in the comments. I'm Jack Fossett. I hope you enjoy the rest of the video.